Buenas tardes, good evening. It's wonderful to see you all here. On behalf of our team in the United Nations University Institute on Globalization, Culture and Mobility, UNU-GCM, it's an immense pleasure for me to welcome you to our 2016 annual guest lecture. UNU-GCM is one of 13 research and training institutes of the United Nations University, located around 12 countries in the world. We're very honored to be located here in Barcelona at the modernist World Heritage Site of Sant Pau. Our presence here is made possible through the kind support of the Ministries of External Affairs and Cooperation and of Education, Culture and Sport in Madrid, by the Generalitat of Catalunya, and by the City Council of Barcelona. UNU's mission as an academic body that is also an agency of the United Nations is to contribute to efforts to resolve the many pressing global problems of human survival, development and welfare that are the concern of the United Nations and its member states, one hopes. Since our establishment in 2013, UNU-GCM has developed lines of research that focus on migration, particularly in relation to intercultural dialogue, statelessness and transcontinental migration, gender, cities and migration, and most recently, and particularly poignantly given our location here on the Mediterranean, crises-related migration. These early years in the life of this institute have coincided with mounting numbers of global migrants and refugees, many of whom are forced to endure alarming situations of humanitarian crises and violations of human rights. The facts are stark. Today, there are over 247 million international migrants, a growing number of whom have been forcibly displaced. Climate change, conflict, poverty, and political oppression lead to contexts where migrants and refugees form mass mixed movements, where vulnerabilities accrue, and where human suffering, insecurities, and the loss of life defy known statistics. The rise of populism and xenophobia exacerbate the civic and political, economic, and sociocultural marginality of migrants, despite the fact that we know that immigration and diversity enrich societies and bring many benefits. Ironically, and despite this very grim scenario of humanity, both adrift and bereft, the world is also witnessing a historic political turn that must be urgently tapped into. After years of being sidelined as a challenge to the primacy of sovereignty, international migration finally entered the realm of international relations on September 19, 2016, when 193 member states of the UN system unanimously adopted the New York Declaration, a set of commitments to be shaped over 2 years into 2 global compacts, one on a comprehensive framework for responsibility sharing regarding refugees, and another on safe, orderly, and regular migration. As politicians begin their debates on how to achieve these compacts, the critical situation afflicting so many people across the world continues to exacerbate. This makes the work done at UNU-GCM, where we adopt an approach that is both interdisciplinary and grassroots-based, all the more urgent. Since 2014, UNU-GCM has represented the United Nations University at the Global Migration Group, an interagency forum that works towards the goals of the UN system in relation to migrants and refugees. In 2017, next year, UNU will chair the Global Migration Group, a role that comes at a turning point for migration in political debates and policy formation. The road ahead is unclear, and it remains to be seen if the member states will successfully take forward the commitments that they have made via the New York Declaration. Nevertheless, for UNU, as chair of the Global Migration Group in 2017, this is a time of responsibility and of challenge, when, at the very least, it has been agreed all round that the narrative of migration must be changed. Few could help us think our way forward, as well as Professor Noam Chomsky, whom we are deeply honored to welcome here today. Of course, he needs no introduction, and it would be overly ambitious of me to even attempt one. Suffice it to say that Professor Chomsky is Emeritus Professor of Linguistics at Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a world-renowned intellectual in the field of linguistics and philosophy. Through his work, he shows us the responsibility of the intellectual to uncover truths and to redress power structures that oppress and deny. Generations of us are indebted to him for offering us the example of the intellectual life as a process and act of solidarity. His work, from his most recent book, Who Rules the World, back to so many seminal texts over the past 6 decades that have shaped collective thinking, teaches us the conceptual roots and language through which social justice can be pursued. If we accept that human history is a history of human mobility, then justice for refugees and migrants must be seen as a moral priority. Friends, we are over 1,550 people in this room here today. There are at least another 2,000 of us outside here in Barcelona and from elsewhere in Europe and around the world who wished to be present, but whom sadly we could not find places for. We hope they're joining us through the live streaming of this event. Please, would you join me in giving a very warm welcome to Professor Noam Chomsky.
Thank you. Pope Francis captured the essence of the crises of immigration in a few simple words. He said, "Migrants are not a danger, they are in danger." The implication is clear. The crises of immigration, so-called, are in significant measure moral crises in the wealthy countries of the world, the societies that have the resources, the capacity to help those who are in severe danger and to mitigate or to resolve the circumstances that lie at the roots of their plight. Rich societies, which furthermore often have significant responsibility for creating the crises in the first place, a consideration that deepens the moral crisis of the rich and the privileged. Reflection on these matters is, I think, essential if we're to face the moral crises honestly and realistically, which is a prerequisite to a humane and constructive response to the enormous human problems right before our eyes, now and very likely to become far worse in the near future unless decisive actions are undertaken. And it is instructive, I think, to reach for these reflections, to reach beyond the events that are before our eyes, which are shattering enough, including the report in yesterday's edition of El País that more than 4,000 desperate refugees have drowned in the Mediterranean this year, fleeing from misery and violence. Migrants are not only in danger, but commonly in extremely severe danger, as we see every day. That is not to deny that migrants can sometimes become a serious burden on the society that receives them. The most extreme case is a devastating catastrophe that is rarely considered a crisis of immigration, though it should be. The rise of settler colonial societies where the migrants arrive with the intention of displacing or exterminating the indigenous population, the most savage form of imperialism, and indeed the foundation of much of modern global society. The most prominent cases are the world's richest and most developed countries. We cannot properly use the term crisis of immigration in such cases. It's far too mild. A better description would be the words of U.S. President John Quincy Adams, the intellectual author of the doctrine of manifest destiny that justified the settler conquest of what is now the United States. In his later years, reflecting on what he and his associates had been doing, he lamented the fate of that hapless race of Native Americans, which we are exterminating with such merciless and perfidious cruelty, continuing to do so in the years that followed with genocidal assaults that won the national territory, along with the conquest of half of Mexico, continuing into the early 20th century. In all of the countries of the so-called Anglosphere, the offshoots of England, the aftermath for those who remained and who survived the onslaught remains severe today, and the painful tale is repeated in other parts of the world as well. Another crisis of immigration, also a foundation of the modern world, is forced migration of captives to slavery. Again, not usually described as a crisis of immigration, and again, not properly captured with such a relatively neutral phrase. The practice reached its most extreme and vicious form in the plantation economy of the American South, where, under hideous conditions, slaves produced the most important commodity in world trade through the 19th century. Cotton, which to an extent not generally realized, served as the basis for modern advanced economies, particularly those of the United States and England, but other countries as well. It's been estimated, for example, that some of 20% of France's wealth derives from its Haitian colony, at the time one of the richest colonies in the world, today a scene of devastation and disaster after centuries of imperial torment, beginning with the murderous Spanish invasion right to the present. Its continuing agony is on the front pages today. Cotton production by slave labor provided the basis for the development of manufacturing, finance, commerce, and retail industries. Contemporary scholarship is just beginning to portray the implications of the slave system for the modern economy, and not to speak of its role in imperial conquest in North America, India, Egypt, and elsewhere. It was also a major factor in the American Revolution, which was fought in part to preserve the institution of slavery from the growing opposition to slavery in England. The history of slavery, much of it just being unearthed by contemporary scholarship, is horrifying, and as in the case of the remnants of the settler colonial onslaught, the aftermath remains grim today. It should be unnecessary to dwell on the severe moral crises that the history poses for the rich societies, or on the moral depravity of the evasion of the terrible history and the unwillingness to attend to the aftermath to the limited extent possible. Well, keeping to less colossal crises of immigration, the country most severely affected by the flood of refugees today is Lebanon, a poor country where some 40% of the population are refugees, some from recent wars in Iraq and Syria, many of them tracing back to Israel's expulsion of Palestinians in 1948. In Lebanon and elsewhere, the descendants are still confined to miserable camps. Jordan, too, absorbed a huge refugee population, as did Syria before its recent cataclysm. The poor African country of Kenya has hundreds of thousands of refugees, mostly fleeing from violence and repression in Somalia. They're surviving in miserable conditions under constant threat of illegal deportation from the Dadaab camps, the largest refugee camps in the world, dating back to the Somali disasters from 1992, in which, as usual, the West had a significant role. Meanwhile, in wealthy France, the squalid Calais refugee camp, known as the Jungle, has been demolished, but there's also a streak of Western compassion. Britain has agreed to take in a few hundred unaccompanied children from the camp, children who have families in the United Kingdom, bypassing the complex procedures of providing proof from persecution. So the lofty values of Western civilization are still being upheld. Ranking high among the most miserable countries in the world is Afghanistan, again with no slight Western responsibility, but it ranks high in another dimension as well, receiving refugees. By now it is an estimated 1.5 million this year, many of them expelled from the rich countries of the West, where they have been refused asylum. The plight of refugees today cannot fail to bring to mind painful moments of recent history. The United States was known as a haven for immigrants, that is, European immigrants. Orientals were excluded by law as soon as they became a significant presence, most of them brought in as virtual slaves, like the forced African immigration. But even within favored Europe, problems arose from the beginning. Benjamin Franklin, the leading American figure of the Enlightenment, urged that Germans and Swedes should be excluded because they are too swarthy. But that proposal was put aside. Irish immigrants in the late 19th century, most of them fleeing after the awful Irish famine, they were treated almost as badly as African Americans, but were finally absorbed, and the same with others. That lasted as long as the country needed a European population to settle what was taken from Native Americans. The first barrier to Europeans was in 1924, aimed at Italians and Jews, more politely at Southern and Eastern Europeans. That barrier lasted until 1965. And the consequences were dire, particularly for Jews, as Nazi Germany descended to the depths of barbarism. In 1938, the Evian Conference was a feeble and failed international effort to deal with the plight of Jews in Nazi Germany. The one enthusiast was Adolf Hitler, who expressed his hope, in his words, that the world, which has such deep sympathy for these criminals, Jews, will at least be generous enough to convert this sympathy into practical aid. We, on our part, are ready to put all these criminals at the disposal of these countries, for all I care, even on luxury ships. Only the Dominican Republic and Costa Rica were willing to offer help. The result was a green light for genocide, to borrow the title of a scholarly study of the Evian Conference. And even after the war, when Holocaust survivors were still living in concentration camps under miserable conditions, and there was no longer any question about the hideous crimes, the barriers were maintained. It's an ugly story that should be better known, no time to go into here, and one that tells us something about the Western values that are coming to the fore again today. One partial exception to the general pattern of refugee absorption today by the poorest countries is Turkey. It's an OECD member with a modern, developed, and highly productive society, but also at the low end of the OECD, and still relatively poor in social and economic development. In the United Nations Human Development Index, Turkey is ranked 72nd, even below Lebanon and Iran, another country that has absorbed much of the detritus of the Western rampages in the region. Turkey houses 2.5 million refugees, including the bulk of those fleeing the Syrian horrors. 90% of these are estimated to be women and children. Turkey has now largely closed its doors to the tens of thousands of desperate people fleeing the latest horrors, which are so grotesque right now in Aleppo under the cruel aerial assault of the Assad government and its Russian allies. Tens of thousands of them are stranded at the border, with many more to come. In response, the rich European countries pressure and bribe Turkey to absorb even more refugees and to keep them away from its borders, while harshly condemning Turkey for closing its own borders. I'm no fan of Prime Minister Erdogan, but his charges of hypocrisy are hardly without merit. The September report of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees outlines the scale of the Syrian migrant crisis. Some 11 million Syrians have fled their homes in the past 5 years of escalating destruction. 13.5 million Syrians are in need of humanitarian assistance within Syria. Almost 5 million have fled to Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, and Iraq, while 6.5 million are internally displaced within Syria. 1 million have requested asylum in Europe. The top receiving countries of the European Union are Germany, with more than 300,000 accumulated applications, Sweden with 100,000. Others have a much more pathetic record. The United States is far behind, having absorbed only a few thousand. The United States is not only the richest and most powerful country in world history with incomparable advantages, but also has major responsibility for generating the refugees who've been fleeing and still are, millions from Iraq alone, and not to speak of the consequences of the U.S.-British invasion elsewhere in the region. The record of Britain is hardly better, and part of the motive for Brexit seems to be to make the record even worse. We should never overlook the fact that the US-UK invasion of Iraq, the source of a large part of the migrant crisis today, was a textbook example of criminal aggression without any credible pretext. In the words of the chief American prosecutor at Nuremberg, Justice Robert Jackson, to initiate a war of aggression is not only an international crime, it is the supreme international crime, differing only from other war crimes in that it contains within itself the accumulated evil of the whole, all of the evil that follows. He was speaking of Nazi Germany, but the words apply to the present situation. In this case, not only the destruction of Iraq, but also the incitement of sectarian conflict that is tearing Iraq and the entire region apart, and the generation of millions of refugees from the invasion itself and those fleeing the aftermath, including the appearance of the monstrous ISIS. The West could also do well to listen to Justice Jackson's stern words to the Nuremberg Tribunal. He said, "We must never forget that the record on which we judge these defendants is the record on which history will judge us tomorrow. To pass these defendants a poisoned chalice is to put it to our lips as well." We can now judge how well Western civilization has risen to this challenge. These reflections apply not just to the torrential flight of refugees from Iraq and its aftermath, but also to the so-called refugee crisis more generally. It's a rather striking fact, which cannot be reiterated too often, that the countries with the least responsibility for generating refugees are handed the responsibility of somehow caring for them, while those with the greatest responsibility for generating refugees are self-absolved from this responsibility, even though, apart from their responsibility, they are far richer, hence more able to deal with whatever problems might arise. Now, that holds not only for refugees fleeing Middle East disasters, but also for the refugees fleeing the wreckage left by U.S. intervention in Central America, and those fleeing Honduras, the leading source of refugees since the Obama-backed military coup of 2009 that expelled the reformist president, restored the harsh, brutal rule of traditional elites, turning Honduras into one of the murder capitals of the world. And the U.S. is reacting much the way Europe is, pressuring and bribing Mexico to keep the victims away from its borders. The same reflections apply to the huge flood of refugees from Africa to Europe, including the 4,000 who have already drowned in the Mediterranean this year in their desperate flight. Here too, of course, there is a history stretching back hundreds of years, reaching right to the present, which we should not have to review, and which underscores another severe moral crisis of the West. The general attitude of Western civilization toward this history was revealed rather clearly in the U.S. global planning at the end of World War II. It was understood by planners that the U.S. would be displacing its European predecessors as the dominant global power, and naturally, careful plans were laid about how to organize the world. The general picture was well described by Henry Kissinger. As he put it, Europe and others should focus on their regional interests, while the United States, which has global interests and responsibilities, will manage the overall framework of order, serving as the respected and legitimate law enforcer that the world needs, as Zbigniew Brzezinski recently put it. Each region was assigned what was called its function within the global system by George Kennan and his State Department staff. So the function of Southeast Asia was to provide resources and raw materials to the former colonial masters and to the United States. When Kennan turned to Africa, he observed that the United States had little interest in the continent, so it should be handed over to Europe to exploit, his term, for European reconstruction. He added also economic development, but that was window dressing, not taken seriously. He suggested as well that the exploitation of Africa, in his words, would lend to the idea of Western European Union that tangible objective for which everyone has been rather unsuccessfully groping in recent months. In other words, a kind of a psychological lift while the United States was taking responsibility for the overall framework of global order. The plans are considered unremarkable. I have found no mention of the idea that after many horrific centuries, Europe's relation to Africa should be to exploit Africa for Europe's reconstruction from wartime damage. The United States, of course, also had direct involvement in African affairs, but in another dimension, slavery, but that too imposes no obligations to the ruined continent. This is by no means ancient history. It continues to the current period in ways that we should know very well, and it's a prime reason why Africans are seeking to escape to the lands of their traditional tormentors, creating a refugee crisis, or more accurately, adding another layer to the moral crisis that Europe is facing. A more immediate reason for the current flood of African immigrants is the attack on Libya, initiated by France and Britain and led from behind by the United States, in Obama's words. The attack on Libya greatly increased casualties by a factor of 10, according to an analysis in the major U.S. establishment journal, Foreign Affairs, also leaving the country a wreck, torn to shreds by warring militias. The attack also opened a flood of weapons and jihadis, primarily to Western Africa, now the leading center of Islamic terror, according to UN figures. The attack also helped ISIS establish an African base, and it opened a funnel for the flood of refugees to Europe, creating another crisis of immigration. It's of considerable interest that throughout the Libyan crisis, the African Union put forth serious and feasible proposals for peaceful diplomatic settlement, which might well have avoided the catastrophe. These have been reviewed in detail in the scholarly literature, which also points out that the proposals were ignored by the imperial triumvirate, France, Britain, the United States, who were intent on pursuing their traditional mission. And for the masters of the world, Northern Africa is not a regional interest of Africa, but rather of Europe, and more generally of NATO, now that its mission has been expanded after the fall of the Soviet Union. Another relevant question is whether Africa might have developed had it not been for Western conquest. Perhaps so. One of the leading historians of Africa, Basil Davidson, wrote that modernizing reforms in West Africa in the mid-19th century were similar to those implemented in Japan at about the same time, and he argues that the potential for development was in substance no different from the potential realized by the Japanese after 1867. Elaborating on this, an African historian comments that the same laudable object was before both of them, but the African's attempt was ruthlessly crushed and its plans frustrated by imperial force. West Africa therefore joined the Third World, but not Japan, the one part of the global South that resisted colonization and the one part that developed with its colonies. Japan was a brutal colonizer, but its former colonies, Taiwan and South Korea, followed the state-led development programs that Japan had borrowed from Britain and the United States, rejecting the Western-imposed neoliberal model. 60 years ago, South Korea was about at the economic level of Ghana. The outcomes are quite different. Taiwan as well, of course China, which also rejected the Western development programs designed for the colonial and post-colonial world. Questions like these should be explored when confronting the moral crisis that the migrant flow has created in the West. The migrant crisis extends far beyond the flight of refugees from violence, chaos, and harsh repression. The huge droughts are already threatening survival for hundreds of millions of people. And there are also factors in some of the most horrendous conflicts, as in Darfur and now Syria. Some 25 million people are displaced by disaster. Considerably more than those fleeing war and terror. And the numbers are bound to increase, particularly as the huge Antarctic glaciers continue to melt, as they are now doing ominously. In Bangladesh alone, tens of millions of people are expected to have to flee in coming years from low-lying plains because of sea level rise and more severe weather, creating a migrant crisis that'll make today's pale into insignificance. Once again, this coming crisis of immigration poses a severe moral crisis for the rich societies. With considerable justice, Bangladesh's leading climate scientist says that these migrants should have the right to move to the countries from which all these greenhouse gases are coming. Millions should be able to go to the United States and to the other rich countries that have grown wealthy while bringing about a new geological era, which geologists call the Anthropocene, marked by radical human transformation of the environment. These catastrophic consequences can only increase, not only for Bangladesh, but for all of South Asia, as temperatures, which are already intolerable for the poor, inexorably rise and the Himalayan glaciers melt, threatening the entire water supply for South Asia. Already in India, some 300 million people lack drinking water. We may soon be facing indescribable catastrophes unless we act quickly and decisively. Well, returning finally to Pope Francis's words, migrants are indeed in danger, severe danger, and we should be devoting ourselves to remedying their plight in all of the many ways that we can, by addressing the causes of their flight, by greatly increasing humanitarian aid, by welcoming them into our midst. And at the same time, we should be reflecting seriously on another familiar adage, physician, heal thyself. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Chomsky, for that very inspiring and at the same time informative and comprehensive analysis of migration and migrants and refugees in the day-to-day. I think we have a little bit of time to take a few questions. I think there will be a lot of questions, so I'd ask you to please keep it brief. Could you please identify yourself and say who you are, and also then keep your question brief so that Professor Chomsky might answer. I think there is a hand that's gone up in the front and in the back. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I am Eva Requena, and I want to ask you, Mr. Chomsky, if Donald Trump wins, what will be the consequences for immigration in the United States? Thank you so much.
Well, Donald Trump's statements are all over the map. He's said about everything you can imagine. But there are some things on which he's very consistent, very consistent. One of them is that he wants to drive the world to disaster as quickly as possible. And literally, that is not an exaggeration. And it's a remarkable comment on the media in the United States and internationally that they do not comment on this. It's an astonishing fact. His positions, one of the major crises that we face, everyone should be completely aware of this, is the threat of environmental catastrophe. I barely mentioned it, and that's just the beginning. His position is very clear. Climate change is not happening. We should increase the use of fossil fuels, including coal, the most destructive. We should eliminate environmental regulations and eliminate the agency that's responsible for them. We should abandon the Paris negotiations, COP21, which are just coming into effect, which are insufficient, but at least provide some kind of a basis for hope. We should withdraw from that. We should refuse to give any aid to poor countries, say like Bangladesh, that are trying somehow to move to sustainable energy. And in general, we should race to the precipice as quickly as possible. That's his core program. And it's not just Donald Trump. It's the entire Republican Party. If you followed the primaries, you would have noticed that every single candidate either denies that climate change is happening or says maybe it is, but we shouldn't do anything about it. In other words, major political party and the world's richest and most powerful country, the most powerful in history, which is sure to set its stamp on future history, immediate history, that party is calling explicitly for destruction of the species, virtual destruction of the species. More astonishing than that is the fact that there's no comment on it. Try to find comment on this amazing fact. Virtually nothing. That's one of his policies. The domestic policies on which he's pretty consistent are radically reducing taxes on the rich and the powerful, on the corporate sector and the wealthy, increasing the military already way beyond, about as great as the rest of the world combined, much more technologically advanced, and adding no new sources of revenue, so you can figure out the domestic consequences. On another issue, his position is more hopeful for human survival than Clinton's. He is calling for reducing tensions with Russia and marginally China, which is a very serious matter. The tensions at the Russian border, and notice the Russian border, not the Mexican border, the tensions at the Russian border are severe, mounting. Both sides are carrying out provocative actions which could explode by accident even into a terminal nuclear war. Both sides are building up their military forces. NATO forces are carrying out exercises a couple hundred meters from the Russian border. Jet planes are buzzing each other. It's an extremely dangerous situation. A lot of it traceable back to decisions in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed, which we should be thinking about seriously. There were two visions of the world presented at the time. One was Mikhail Gorbachev's, what he called a common European home, a integrated security system throughout all of Europe and European Asia, with no military blocs and integration. That was abandoned. The West insisted on something different: collapse of the Soviet Union, expansion of NATO, at first to East Germany, then right to the Russian border, offers to Ukraine to join NATO, a severe threat to Russia. It's just in simple geopolitical terms. Russia's carrying out its own repressive and violent actions. All of this is building up, and Trump, to his credit, is saying, let's try to say something, to do something to dampen this down instead of intensifying it. So I think those are the kinds of things we can anticipate, although the idea of somebody like Trump in control of the option of initiating a nuclear war, which is literally terminal for everyone, that's very frightening to security analysts across the spectrum, which is why almost all of them are very frightened of his possible presidency.
Thank you. I think there was one hand at the back there that I saw. Would you like to, yes, would you like to ask your question?
Well, the second part, thank you very much.
Could you
I'm sorry, yes. Cristina Fernandez, a journalist, and I want to thank again for being here, Professor. Here.
Okay.
Here. Thank you very much for being here with us. And my question is a little bit the second part of my predecessor about the future in a few days of your country. I should ask, I would like to know why there is such a big majority of citizens of United States that believe that a change with the Republican and Mr. Trump as a president can be better for all of us. Because the result of today is like a 50-50. It's difficult for me to believe that there is a 50% of your country's citizens that believe the change will be better for them and for the whole world.
Well, let's look a little bit closer. Take, say, Austria, where about 50% of the population are supporting a kind of a neo-Nazi party. Austria, one has some memories of Austria. Or take Germany, where a right-wing ultranationalist party is now not winning, but coming in local elections ahead of Merkel's party, okay? I'm old enough to remember listening to Hitler's speeches over the radio. I didn't understand the words, but the meaning was significant. Actually, the first article I wrote was in February 1939, and it was about Barcelona. It was about the fall of Barcelona to fascist forces. And the picture, my own fear at the time, a 10-year-old, not very sophisticated, was that this evil spread of fascism over the world was unstoppable. What do we hear now in Europe? Echoes of the same thing. That's pretty serious. I'm not suggesting that we're on the verge of a return to Nazism, but it's pretty serious. Now let's go back to the United States. It's also serious, though not at this level. And I think if you look at the sources, they're pretty similar in both. There are plenty of differences, but they're somewhat similar in the United States and Europe. Part of it is simply racism. Europe, in my opinion, has always been much more racist than the United States. In Europe, homogeneous societies could suppress their fear of any contamination by a small number of different people. So as long as everybody's blonde and blue-eyed in Denmark, we're not racist. But as soon as a small percentage of others come in, it all blows up. We're seeing this all over Europe. The United States has a history of horrible racism, but nevertheless it is something of a melting pot, a familiar term. If you stand on a street corner in New York, you see every imaginable kind of person, race, class, gender, and nobody pays any attention. It's bad enough in the United States, but possibly even worse in Europe. Another factor is the neoliberal programs of the past generation, both in the United States and Europe. In Europe, it took the severe and destructive form of the austerity programs after 2008. The effect of these programs has been to cast aside large numbers of people who have, so in the United States, for example, wages for male workers are about what they were in the 1960s. Meanwhile, benefits have declined, hope for the future has declined, they see themselves ignored, suppressed, similar phenomena in Europe, and one result has been contempt for institutions, political institutions, financial institutions, almost all of them, and the collapse of centrist political parties, striking in Europe, and the Trump phenomenon, and indeed the Sanders phenomenon are a more promising case, are signs of the same thing in the United States. So I think it's not hard to find the sources of these developments, which are very serious ones. We're facing imminent crises. The migrant crisis, in my opinion, is essentially a moral crisis of the West. But there could be a really huge migrant crisis as the effects of global warming increase. Of course, in the case of possible nuclear war, the other major shadow, there's no migrant crisis. Nobody's left to talk about. But no time to really go into it deeply, but I think we can see somewhat similar phenomena and roots in the United States, where it's on the front pages right now, and in Europe, where it's constant.
Thank you. I see a hand up there, yes?
Hello, Marta Soszyńska from Doctors Without Borders. Tying to what you just said, I wanted to ask about your role, what you think about the role of public media, of mass media in shaping the public opinion about migrant crisis.
Well, let's just take a look at the way, I mean, I don't read the Spanish and Catalan press regularly, so I can't really comment, but take the New York Times, the BBC, other major international media, and ask a simple question. During the primary season in the United States, how much attention have they given to the fact that we are living in a time of extreme crisis, an environmental crisis, a threat of nuclear war? In both cases, with Western policy decisions having a very significant role. In the face of this, how much attention have they given to the crises themselves and to the fact that in the election campaign, which they're covering massively, this is not discussed at all? And I think that's the answer to your question. It's a shocking, astonishing fact. If some historian will ever look back on this, they'll be astonished. How can this be happening? How can it be happening that with the human species is now facing questions that have never arisen in the 200,000 years of human history? Literally questions of survival. There's a major political campaign going on in the most important, powerful country in world history. Nothing is being said about them, and the media are saying nothing about them. What does that tell you about the organs of information and analysis?
Thank you. Yes, there's a hand that's just gone up there.
Hi, Noam. I just wanted to ask you a question, but you have already answered. So it was about this very first article that you wrote about Barcelona's fall, but you already answered that I had read that this was the case, but I didn't know exactly whether it was true that you wrote your first article about Barcelona's fall. But anyway, now that I got the micro, I would use the opportunity to thank you for all the wonderful lectures I had the privilege to attend some 35 years ago at MIT on imperial ideology that you gave together with, I guess, Louis Kampf was the name? Louis Kampf, another professor at MIT that gave a lecture with you on imperial ideology. And anyway, thank you very much, because those lectures changed my outlook of the world and the life that we live in. Thank you very much.
I think many of us echo those thanks. So I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. Can we keep them as questions? And could you please introduce yourself? So I'm seeing lots of hands. The gentleman with the gray there, the gray sleeve. Yes.
Hello, my name is Rujamati Wallace. Thank you, Mr. Chomsky, for struggling for truth and justice on our behalf. The question is, who will carry on that struggle when you're no longer with us or can't do it? How should we organize ourselves, and do we have some hope?
I think just the way it's being done right now. In the United States, in Europe, plenty of people, many young people are organizing, are deeply concerned about these issues. You know better than I do about what's happening in Spain, same in the United States. The Bernie Sanders phenomenon is a very significant development. In the United States for 100 years, and radically in recent years, elections have been pretty much for sale, literally. You could pretty well predict the outcome of an election, not just for president, but also for Congress, by just looking at campaign expenditures. It's a remarkable close correlation, and that means policies as well. For the first time, a candidate came out, almost unknown nationally, no funding, no corporate funding, no rich people funding him, developed quickly a mass popular following, dramatically among young people, among the so-called millennials, those who've grown up during this millennium. I think almost 3/4 supported him, Sanders. And he came very close to capturing a nomination. It's unheard of in American, or in fact any political history. The Corbyn phenomenon in England is somewhat similar. These are, and it could last. There's momentum developing which is carrying it forward. Same here. That's the hope of the future, and it's very much alive.
Thank you. There's one hand in the middle there that I can see. Yeah. Would you like to ask your question? Yeah.
Is it me? Good evening. Edward Arcon, a faculty in the engineering discipline. Thanks ever so much, Professor Chomsky, for sharing your wisdom with us, with this audience. There's no need to say again that your analysis of the reality of the crisis of immigration was very thorough and impeccable. But you, beyond increasing the awareness of this, you were also calling for action. So can you elaborate and share with us how you envision to act upon this, the type of actions, both intellectually, politically, and educationally?
Well, there are many actions that can be taken. Some of them are very easy for the rich societies. I mean, if Lebanon, poor country, can accept refugees to the point where 40% of the population are now refugees, surely the rich countries of the West can do vastly more. I mean, the most admirable case in Europe is Angela Merkel. That's 300,000, not like in one of the richest countries in the world. And the rest of Europe is far below, and the United States is even worse. As I said, Europe and the United States, their main reaction to the refugee crisis is to keep them away from us, bribe Turkey and Mexico to keep them away. One thing we can do is overcome that severe moral crisis, which also means thinking about our own history. When you see this awful article in El País yesterday, which I'm sure you saw, with the picture of the figures and also the picture of the desperate refugees drowning as they're trying to hang on to a boat, and ask yourself, why are people fleeing from Africa to Europe? Not very hard to find the answer. And it goes right to the present. It's not ancient history. Could review it. That's one thing we can do. The second thing, which is easy, is give vastly more humanitarian aid than is now being given. There are tens of millions of refugees housed in hideous conditions who need simple humanitarian aid. For the rich countries of the West, that's a fraction, small fraction of their wealth. Nothing like what a poor country like Lebanon or Jordan has to expend. A deeper thing that we can do is look at the sources of the crises and ask how we can, two questions. First, how are we responsible for them? Answer is quite a lot. And secondly, what can we do to ameliorate them? And there's plenty that can be done. Take, say, Syria, which is an utter catastrophe. Right now, it's not easy to think of a constructive solution, but there still are paths that could be taken. The only slim hope for Syria is some kind of negotiated diplomatic settlement alongside of local ceasefires to reduce the level of violence. And there are slim but possible opportunities for that. Lakhdar Brahimi, a very respected, properly respected diplomat, came pretty close to some possible solutions. In fact, at one point in 2012, the Russians actually floated a proposal to move to a transitional government in which, of course, the Assad regime would participate. There's no conceivable possibility that there could be a diplomatic process in which they would refuse to participate, and in which they would participate but say, we say, we're not going to participate, we'll commit suicide. That's not going to happen. So any sensible proposal would have to include a transitional government in which the Assad regime would participate. And the Russians in 2012 suggested, the Russian ambassador to the UN, that Assad might be removed in the course of the negotiations. The West refused to consider that. France, Britain, and the United States dismissed that option with no attention, apparently on the belief that the Assad regime would soon collapse. Well, sacrificed huge numbers of Syrians to disaster and destruction. There are still possibilities today. There are serious issues right now in Iraq. The city of Mosul, as you know, is under attack by a complex of forces. Iraqi army, Kurdish Peshmerga, there's some Turkish forces, Shiite militias. They're attempting to destroy a really monstrous outcome of the US-UK invasion of Iraq, namely the self-described Islamic State. What happens militarily, they're sure to win some kind of victory. What happens then? Two major Iraqi cities, Sunni cities, have already been freed from ISIS, Ramadi and Fallujah, both of which were pretty much wrecked in the process, creating huge crises. The case of Mosul could be much worse unless steps are taken right now to try to implement as much as possible, a civilized outcome to this battle. Could be a much worse catastrophe. Getting rid of ISIS is militarily possible, but if you don't look at the roots of the problem, the results will probably be something worse. That's been happening over and over for the last 15 years. Just take a look at the policies of the West with regard to radical Islamic terror for the past 15 years. 15 years ago, it was confined to tribal areas on the Afghan-Pakistan border. Now it's all over the world. As I said, the worst case right now is Western Africa, a direct result of the French, British, US invasion of Libya. The invasion of Iraq by the US and Britain spread it enormously. The first year after the invasion, terror increased by a factor of 7 times, pretty much predicted by Western intelligence agencies. Every blow of the sledgehammer makes it worse. The reflexive reaction of the West is to smash things with force. That's our comparative advantage, violence. Every time you do it, things get worse. Unless we begin to look at the roots of the problems for which we have plenty of responsibility in Africa and Central America and the Middle East, unless we look at those, we're just going to make the situation worse. That's something else we can do. So there's a great range of options open to us, but we have to face them, and we have to at least begin by recognizing our own deep responsibility for what has been happening in these crisis-ridden areas.
I know there are lots of questions from around the room, but I don't think we have the time for that. I want to thank Professor Chomsky for everything you've done for us, not just today, but in the last 60 years, for giving us the concepts, the way to articulate a sense of a way forward through all this trouble and chaos and conflict that there is around us. So thank you so much, Professor Chomsky. Thank you. Please join me.